Hi, today you're going to have a flipped lesson on the Supreme Court and the federal courts. What I want you to do is you have access in Google Slides and in Google Drive a document called the Supreme Court Notes. As we go through this, my expectation is that you can stop the video and take notes on it. So the notes have different spots where there are blanks, and you should fill in those blanks as we go along. So the Supreme Court is the third branch of government that we've been talking about. We've talked about executive, we've talked about legislative, and now we're going to talk about the judicial branch. The court system is created by Article 3 of the Constitution. There are three levels of the federal court system. The first one is the Supreme, or the top one is the Supreme. That is the top court of the land. They can hear appeals. So state courts and federal courts can appeal to the Supreme Court whether or not a ruling, a law, or an act is constitutional. This is the supreme law of the land. It's the final law. Whatever they say is what happens. There is no jury, but rather the Supreme Court is made up of 9 justices. The appellate court is below the Supreme Court. This is where people can go and appeal a past decision from a lower court, from a district court, and see whether or not their rights were violated or their ruling was fair. This is always a place where you go after an initial verdict. If you're found guilty of a ruling or you feel your rights have been violated, you go to the appellate court. Because you move to the bottom level, which is the district court, that's where the first place where cases are heard. This is the first court of the federal level, and there are juries in this. Jury of 12 people. They hear cases between the states, and they can hear cases dealing with federal law. Additionally, some cases are heard on a local level or a state level. So there are Virginia Beach level court cases. There are Virginia Beach courts. There are Virginia state courts, and they hear things related to Virginia or Virginia Beach law. So they're going to deal with state or local laws. This diagram just gives you an idea. You have a lot of district courts. There are 94 districts. There's a U.S. Court of Trade, U.S. Court of Federal Claims. So you go into the district courts. If you want to appeal the verdict, you can go to the appellate court. There are 13 circuit courts. The Court of Appeals is often called the circuit courts too. And then if you want to appeal the ruling from there, you can go to the U.S. Supreme Court. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 8 of them are associate justices, and there is a Chief Justice today. The Chief Justice today is a man named John Roberts. All justices are appointed by the president, and then the Senate has to approve them. You may recall recently the president has appointed 2 justices, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and they were approved by the Senate. Once you are approved to the U.S. Supreme Court, you serve for life unless you choose to step aside and step down, which you are able to do. But otherwise, it is a lifelong term. You can be impeached, but of all of the justices that have held the position, none have ever been impeached. So what does the Supreme Court do? The Supreme Court is going to interpret the Constitution. We've been talking about this when we talk about constitutional rights. They determine whether or not laws or actions of the government or the president are constitutional or unconstitutional. If something is unconstitutional, it goes against the Constitution. Earlier cases are appealed to the Supreme Court. So you don't automatically go to the Supreme Court. You have to start on a lower level. In this unit, we will talk a little bit more about some cases and how the Supreme Court viewed the appeals. The process of having your case appealed to the Supreme Court is called judicial review because the court is reviewing the previous case. The Supreme Court gives its opinion, and that is the end of the story. And a Supreme Court decision cannot be overturned unless it is overturned by another Supreme Court decision, which could not happen for years. Usually it's years down the road, but sometimes it never happens. Typically, the Supreme Court hears only about 100 cases a year, but thousands upon thousands are appealed to the court. Because the Supreme Court is the supreme law of the land, they fall under what is called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause means the Supreme Court and the federal government is the supreme law of the land. Therefore, if the state of Virginia made a law that violated the Constitution and the Supreme Court ruled against that law would be struck down and the state of Virginia's law would be null and void. You'll see that when we talk about Loving v. Virginia, which was the Supreme Court ruling about Virginia state law banning interracial marriage. When the Supreme Court looks at the Constitution, they interpret the Constitution. The Supreme Court can have several different interpretations. Typically, their interpretations fall into one of two categories: conservative or liberal. But this does not mean Republican, nor does it mean Democrat. It doesn't even mean conservative in terms of, President Trump's a conservative, President Obama's a liberal. A conservative interpretation of the Constitution is a strict reading of the Constitution. It looks at how things were written in the 1700s. So if we talk about a question of marriage, it would look at whether or not the Constitution talks about marriage. If the Constitution makes no mention of marriage, it would not look at it. It would say it's not in there and we are not going to deal with it. When we talk about a liberal interpretation of the Constitution, we read it with a modern perspective. So we might look at that if we were questioning marriage. You might say, well, marriage is protected by the 14th Amendment, and that aspect, because it's a legal binding contract, the 14th Amendment would deal with it. So that would be a liberal interpretation. We don't look at it as it was written in the 1700s. We look at it as if it was what it could mean today. So now what I want you to do is I want you to define these words: appeal, judicial review, justices, unconstitutional. You will also see that you need to define John Marshall and John Roberts. So you need to know who those people are. After you have done those words and terms and people, you should continue on and click on the video, the link right here that you will see in your notes, and you should answer these questions. It's a TED Ed talk that deals with how Supreme Court justices get their jobs. And then finally, this Brain Pop video here will review a lot of the concepts we've talked about in this flipped lesson, but I additionally want you to answer the question, what is an appeal and how does it work? If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask me in class during academic support in case things are unclear.